Great, welcome back. We are in the third video in the series of climate racism, moving on to military climate racism. And we're starting with the question, can you name an oil war? Think about it for a second. Yeah, take a note. So here we go. So actually since 1973, oil has been the dominant reason for war. I recently learned this in a talk, No War, No Warming. But oil interest has been going further back in warfare. These wars that are named here below are from an article, 5 oil wars that ended in disaster or something. Let me just take my notes here. So I will add the link again in the article with the resources list. Also, if you wrote down World War I or World War II, you also get points. Of course, there were many other factors here in these wars involved, but in both wars, oil was really starting to be instrumental. It was a time when oil industry was developing, and if we look at how we got the infrastructure for oil today, it is through these World War times that there's been massive state taxpayers' money funding for the infrastructure for oil extraction, all in the name of national security. So companies that would otherwise probably not really be, surviving on a market that would be fair, got huge state injections, and they still get that state injections till today under the name of national security. Also, it turned oil, which has been around and known to man for thousands of years in places in the world like China and Latin America and the Middle East, where it had been used for oil lamps, medicine, and coating boats. It turned, in these World War I and beyond, it turned oil into a weapon. Access to oil became primary for nation-state military security, tank, airplanes, you name it. They don't really do their job without fossil fuels. So another war you might have thought of where fossil fuels played into the geopolitical military mongering was Syria. So here again, whilst we see that there are many conflicts in a country already, we often see that interference of the Western military imperial forces depend on some sort of interest in resource domination. So I'm going to read here the slide. Northeastern Syria is an important region owing to its rich natural resources, particularly fossil fuels in the form of natural gas and oil. Indeed, this area contains 95% of all Syrian oil and gas potential, including Al Omar, the country's largest oil field. Prior to the war, these resources produced some 387,000 barrels of oil per day and 7.8 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually, and were of great economic importance to the Syrian government. However, more significantly, nearly all existing Syrian oil reserves, estimated at around 2.5 billion barrels, are located in the area currently occupied by the US government. So a few more overall notes on the military complex, and why I really advocate today that if you support social media for Black Lives Matter and defund police, and you are a climate justice activist, you really need to up the game and start talking about defunding the military, as the military has not only been crucial in colonization and the land grabbing and resource grabbing in the past, but it is doing so today, and it has a track record of being the worst polluter in the world and is exempted from required emission reduction since 97. So there are lots of laws like Clean Air Act or Endangered Species Act and Bird Migration Protection Act, and a lot of these acts that are there to protect the environment, the military is exempted from. They do not have to follow the law. Basically, they're above the law. And so how this also manifests is that not just in wartime, like the US bombing forests in Vietnam, where Agent Orange has, devastated forests, but also in peacetime, so-called peacetime, military bases where there's tests with or exercises with all sorts of weapons, including nuclear weapons. And so we've seen the US do more than 1,000 nuclear tests, and that's predominantly done on indigenous land. And after those tests, we see families getting sick, the water being polluted, the crops of the land being, no longer usable because it makes people sick. And we see entire families that are missing, 34 cousins, uncles, aunts, because of dying, because of sickness. So I noted earlier, I should note that the Pentagon is the biggest polluter in the world, and it pollutes more than 100 nation states put together. So now looking a little bit more at military climate racism in climate disaster zones. And a classic example here is Katrina. I don't know if people remember Katrina. It was in 2005 in New Orleans, where you had a hurricane. And as New Orleans is a city with a lot of neighborhoods that were really, Black, vibrant, culturally rich neighborhoods. And we've seen the stark division between aid to Black citizens and white citizens in this climate disaster zone. So one example is the media. We see in a climate disaster zone, people are getting hungry and don't have access to food, their houses devastated. And you see how the media reports that white people find food and Black people loot. And that has real consequences because after Katrina, cops were given okay to shoot looters. We see white New Orleans has recovered. This is 11 years after the storm. Black New Orleans has not. And so there is this recognition, sometimes you see it in the news, that there is this stark division of racial divide, both in the amount of help that there is, as the amount of oppression or cops shooting people that actually need help. We also saw in this case the military putting crosses on houses that were supposed to be checked for if it was safe to go in there, if there were dead bodies in there, and they marked those houses in Black neighborhoods, like they were checked and there were 0 dead people in there. And then people coming back to their house like 6 months later and finding all sorts of dead people who had drifted in there with the water, and their houses had never been checked. So it's really traumatic experiences on top of traumatic experiences where we see Black lives don't matter in climate climate impacted zones. Another example is non-white residents of St. Martin who experienced that the Irma evacuation showed racial discrimination. This was not so long ago. And as we see who is being ushered to safety and who's left behind, we see a clear pattern as well. And as this is questioned, there's somebody saying, I'm sorry, this is just another way of saying, I'm sorry, only whites, there are only whites on the boat. So it's important that we stop using this example of climate change is about all of us, we're all in the same boat. I kind of like this post from XR Uganda that says, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. Kind of what happened at the Titanic. You see the difference of class and divisions. Black lives criminalized, land grabbing authorized. So when it comes to looting, if you loot, we will shoot, is one attitude that we see in New Orleans, whereas the mass looting of resource extraction, of invading indigenous lands. Remember, all of the US is actually indigenous lands, but within the US there are still today 574 federally recognized indigenous tribes and nations. And so on the right we see Standing Rock, the protest against a pipeline, and earth defenders really rising to say water is life and we will not let you pass. We've seen military employed, and they really come with the equipment of the military complex. So this was a short one. Ending with 3 questions once again. Is your climate activism calling for defunding military? Why are civilian victims of imperial oil wars so easily forgotten in struggle for climate justice? And how does your theory of change in climate activism account for military violence and power to back up the extractive economy? I will let you reflect on that and hope to talk about it more in our discussions, and I will make the final video on climate racism and the media.